Okay. Good morning, everybody in the offline and online audience to our second breakfast meeting on the South China Sea and the conflicts in the South China Sea. I'm very happy to welcome Edyta Roszko. She's a senior researcher at the Michelson Institute, so she comes from the house where this event is happening today. And Edyta has a very impressive, I met her before, and she has a very impressive, she's led a very impressive life because she lived in so many countries that I can't even remember. And maybe she has a hard time too. But what's more impressive is that she recently got an ERC starting grant for her project Transoceanic Fishes, Multiple Mobilities in and out of the South China Sea. So that's really impressive because it's a highly competitive funding scheme, and she got it. That's why she's here in Bergen. She's also, I read on the website, involved in a local project in a collaboration with UIB, with the University of Bergen, on the commoning appropriation and dispossession of heritage, like heritage as claim making. So I'm very happy that you're here today. Welcome. And we will start out like yesterday with a brief presentation by Edyta on the topic.
First of all, good morning. And thank you, Julia, for the introduction. It is really a pleasure to be here. And I think we have yesterday with the presentations of Alan and Alfred, get some kind of sense for at least those who heard this presentation and idea about the South China Sea dispute. So I will maybe start from the beginning to wrap up their main points before I will go to the fishers. What I want to do in this presentation is basically, can I ask for the PowerPoint? Perfect. Shift the gaze from the state claimants to fishing communities and long-term connection in the South China Sea. And maybe we should remind ourselves that the legal regime of exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles, which gives the states exclusive sovereign rights, not sovereignty, but rights, sovereign rights to the management, exploitation, and also preservation of submarine and marine resources. It's actually represent the largest enclosures in the world, which nationalized vast expanses of the ocean and resources, and basically extended the national sovereignties of the countries beyond the terrestrial jurisdictions. So, but the connections of political sovereignty with resources and people is historically modern, very modern idea. And for neo-Confucian countries like Vietnam or China, sovereignty in the past was mostly defined in terms of human residence or social organization. So when the 20th century Western concept of homogeneous bonded space come into life and basically replace the imperial understanding of unbounded space and territory, fishers have been inscribed also into cartographic order of the present nation state. So with the widespread acceptance of this new regime, many countries in East and Southeast Asia started to basically show their readiness to enclose and nationalize their fishing fleets and ocean spaces within maritime spaces. And a little bit to de-exoticize that, let's look, for example, at the UK. So UK is a good, interesting example. Some noise. Let the IT team fix that. Is it me? Maybe it's mine, the microphone. Yeah.
So it was yours.
Okay, a little. Yeah. You take this off?
technical break.
I will keep that here. Okay, so we continue. So I think I have this on my eye. Okay, now. Susan, could you? Because it's getting, I think it's getting into my eye.
So sorry. Sorry. So it's not working. Yeah. Okay. Can you talk into this one instead? Will that be possible?
Okay, let's try.
I can hold it for you.
Yes, wonderful. Maybe I have a quite strong, so I will take this out because it's getting into my eye. So let's think about the UK. So UK from 1956 to 76, the UK was involved in so-called Cod War, 3 Cod Wars between Iceland, when basically Iceland tried to limit the access of the UK to their fishing zones and started to establish the zone of first 4 nautical miles, then 12 nautical miles, then 50 nautical miles until established 200 nautical miles of fishing zone, and actually won the case. And UK only established the exclusive economic zone in 2014. And if we think about that, is that even the UK has now is the 5th largest economic zone, exclusive economic zone in the world. It actually means that it contracted its ambitions to Britannia rules the waves and the open sea, basically colonial imperial ambitions to the 200 nautical miles. So this kind of establishment of exclusive economic zone and how it creates disputes is not only characteristic for Asian countries who try to basically delineate their maritime territories, but also we have here in Europe. So how to demarcate the borders? And yesterday, Alan and Alfred tried to show, complicated treaties, delimitation from certain points, how we could do that. But there are other means which basically are enabled by navigation, technologies, naval patrols, military infrastructure, and maritime militia, and fishers' bodies who basically through the presence in the South China Sea mark and perform the maritime borders. So, and that's what China and Vietnam basically are trying to do, also to mark their borders with the fishing activities, which basically until 20th century was a zone of connections and resource commons. And interestingly, so ethnic categories like Han, Viet, we have also Cham who lived in Vietnam, Austronesian speaking people who knows for their seafaring legacies. So they were all present in those areas. I don't mention Bugis, Sama, and other groups which are now part of Indonesia or the Philippines or Malaysia. And their activities in those seas intersect with occupational identities like fisher, but also shipbuilder, pirate, smuggler, poacher, transporter. So what we have now today is that these categories like Vietnamese fishers or Chinese fishers are projected very much into the distant past. And we can't say who these people were in the past, whether because people have overlapping ethnic identities, and we're thinking in the terms of the nation state today. So basically how these modern categories of UNCLOS or exclusive economic zone, which are historically contingent processes, are basically projected far into the past to make particular claims. So let me go to the next. And I just want to a little bit say about the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. I think Alan yesterday mentioned, but I just want to take from a little bit different angle. So what the court or arbitration did is that it refuted China's 9-dash on the basis of historical claims, and said that all those, the Chinese fishermen and navigator, were present in those disputed areas, and also of other countries, no one of them claimed the exclusive right, and this presence was not mutually exclusive. And you know, we have historical records which shows that, for example, they exchange greetings between each others. In the 19th century, they ask about the weather, you know, so they are, for example, from the Nguyen dynasty sources, when they met in those areas and they ask themselves, you know, about some topographic details. So the PCA ruling offer insight into how fishing rights are used by the states to enforce closures and enclosures at sea, but also goes to the heart of cartographic imaginations of countries like China and Vietnam, how actually they think about the territory and about presence of the fishers. So the South, as I said, China territorial claims to most of the South China Sea overlaps 200 nautical miles of exclusive zones with other countries, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, which basically makes that the high sea, open sea are disappearing, and that of course creates the conflict, because the South China Sea is quite interesting case where basically this if this 200 nautical miles is measured from the coast, so basically we have overlapping claims, and that results that marine resources functions as a rival goods, indexing basically territorial sovereignty, and particularly between the Vietnamese and Chinese fishermen. So what it happens that this growing demand for fish and simultaneous decline of marine resources incite countries to encourage their fishers to move from the inshore to offshore fishing in the South China Sea. And for example, Vietnamese fishers are eligible for the subsidies from the countries if they do the 4 fishing trips at least 150 nautical miles in 1 year. So they have to squeeze sometimes in one season, and they have to go to the areas where there is no fish sometimes, but they have to, in a way, perform fishing. And also China encouraged to build the big trawlers, steel hull trawlers. So there is a huge overcapacity. There is more trawler than really a fish in the sea. So such performing of a fishing operation I call spectacular fishing, because it's embodiment of sovereignty and the extension of the body nation, geobody, if we use the Tongchai term, and fishers actually get the relevance in that spectacle, and their practice might be economically empty, but basically visually productive in the terms of stating these claims. So, so as I said, to just wrap, the subsidized, militarized, and state-supported Chinese and Vietnamese fishers are at the forefront of this dispute. And I would like to say a little bit now more about the whole subsidies, because they might actually help to engage in thinking what could be done, also what kind of actionable areas we could identify for the solutions on that. And I think my team, Hank and postdocs, they work on those issues, and they show that basically we don't have a Chinese state, but they are the different levels. So we don't have homogeneous China, but they are central government, but also local governments, provincial governments, and all these bodies, they also have a particular stake in those. And these regulations and these developments, they are not always in the strict line from the central government down to the ground. Okay, so maybe just a few key takes away just to remember that capacity increasing subsidies we could define as harmful because they actually encourage fishermen to operate in disputed waters and further the state's respective sovereignty claims in contravention to the domestic and international sustainability goals. They might be intended well, but they work actually they become very problematic, and they are also environmentally harmful, and basically they encourage illicit behavior and undermine any effort towards sustainable fisheries. And interestingly, what they do also, despite of the South China Sea conflict and the arrival climates, they bring Vietnamese and Chinese fishers together because they are interconnected through Sino-Vietnamese harvesting and trade of endangered marine species, and basically meeting and fueling market for demand for this product. So just to very quickly, also it's worth to remember that China is #1 and Vietnam is among the top countries subsidizing fisheries in the world. And fishing fleets are given special significance by China and Vietnam paramilitary organizations. So they basically aim to solidify the state's positions in the South China Sea. And I just want to say a little bit about the maritime militia and where I look at fishers on both on the Vietnamese and Chinese side. So basically they represent local fishers who receive training and allowance from the government to be conscripted into the militia. Vietnam, it's also now extend that even further from the central Vietnam to the Mekong Delta. And they are organized in the unit enterprises, both in China and Vietnam, and which are usually state-owned. And they have a size of military battalion. And Vietnam, in a way, emulate China because China have much more experience and is much better in organizing these groups. But Vietnam law 2009 and modified 2019 law on civil defense force provide now legal foundation for the establishment of maritime militia, which states that coastal and insular communes can organize squads or platoons of militia. And 2019 Vietnam law, which is quite recent, follows China model to allow the organization of the permanent militia and self-defense force. So fishers are sometimes required to defend sovereignty, conduct intelligence, engage in patrol, surveillance, resupply, and other missions as a part of fishing militia and maritime defense in the South China Sea. And we sometimes going through these reports in the newspapers that so many Vietnamese boats were close to Hainan without fishing, that they collect intelligence, or opposite, that Chinese fishers were present in close to China's coast. So there are all these kind of reports we sometimes go through and we hear about that. How real are, that's another question. But just to put a little bit flesh on that, and from my ethnographic work, I have done research on small offshore islands on the Vietnamese coast and also on the Chinese side. So Hainan, which is not that small, but for example, Vietnamese small islands, and they are all stepping stone to the disputed areas of the Paracels and Spratly, because fishers from those islands are recruited as a maritime militia, and they are recruited because they have historical presence in those areas, and they have a long-term relations with those areas. They, for example, in the 19th century, Vietnamese from one small island, they were paying tax in the turtle shells, in the fish sauce to the royal court. So they have to go to this disputed areas of the Paracels and Spratly and basically collected these goods. They were also part of the Navy, Royal Navy, which collected cargo from the wreck ships in those areas like Dutch, Portuguese, and British, and basically had to share the spoils with the royal court. So they operate as a organized navy. They might start as a piratic groups, but once the state learn what they are doing, formalize that, and basically what's happened in the past, recruit fishers for its own also deal making, and what we have today also, that the states also look at the fishers as actors who have particular knowledge, who have particular skills, and might be also useful for particular agenda. And we know that fishers from those areas, they were heavily involved in the illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, and they transpass into foreign exclusive economic zones, for example, in Vietnamese case, as far as Australia, Vanuatu, or other Oceanian countries. And we have also from Chinese side those examples too. When China started to build artificial island on South China Sea in the Paracels and Spratly, fishers were subsidized, and what they did, they basically extracted on the massive scales fossilized giant clams, which were part of the coral reef, and turned them into the artwork and sold on the market. So they basically operated like a businessman. But it would be too easy to blame them, because once the state built the islands on those areas, it will be covered with the cement, beton, and basically they will lose the access which they have in the past. So there was no point for them to be more environmentally friendly, and they are trying to survive. They are trying to find the way how they could basically earn also money. So what they did, they found that those giant fossilized giant clams, which probably were part of the coral reef for, if not the million years, so 1,000 years, I don't know how long this kind of fossilization take part, how many years that takes. So they found that it could be basically carved like jade, and could be turned into the artwork, and they could sell that. And that was really, so there was tons and tons of this coral, of this giant clams coming to the harbors. So just to quickly wrap, and the Permanent Court in 2016 indeed found that the Chinese fishermen were involved in those harmful practices, which basically degrade coral reef, and there was widespread chopping of reefs by fishermen. And China was aware of that, but they didn't do anything to intervene. And explanation from China was very interesting, because China, to the court, so the spokesman explained that basically those massive reclamation of the Paracels and Spratly was ecological environmental conservation that created eco-friendly reefs and green construction, and it was simulation of the nature only built on that coral. So the tribunal and the experts said, well, it was built on a dead coral because the fishermen first basically killed the coral by extraction of that. But as I said, it would be too easy blame those fishermen, because what this law, so in 2015, in March, when I was doing my research in Hainan government, probably facing the pressure from the central government, issued the new regulation banning the harvest, transport, and unloading of fossilized giant clam shells from the vessels. But the regulation didn't forbid sale of these giant clams if they are turned into the artwork. So fishers found the loophole, and they found the way how to deal with that. And 2017, there came a total ban for the sell giant clams, whatever this is, artwork or in the SRO material. But it came too late, because the artificial islands were already built. So for communities, that was quite shocking, that basically they couldn't continue that. And they have to find the whole economy of the fishing town went down, and they have to think about the new ways how they could earn money. So to find the link between subsidies and those fishers' behavior, so what I found that there was allocation from the local governments of clamshells, quotas for these clamshells, legitimized fishers, extractions of shells from coral reef. I don't know how much actually they could bring, but there was certain quotas. So in some way that legitimize and incentivize fishers to compete and overexploit the fishing stock, but also to extract those giant clams because they have quota for that. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that in 2013, the president, he visited Tanmen, promised that they will be provided subsidies and encourage them to extend their operations. And local population read that. It might be not intention of the presidency, but read that as basically encouragement and for those extractions of this part of the coral reef, and that generate a short-lived and unsustainable wealth that facilitated the transformation of the high seas into national territory. And the resulting environmental havoc in the South China Sea was mitigated on the paper by rather delayed environmental law in 2017 and regulation that targeted local population. So the state's environmental campaigns against the extraction of and trade of giant clam shells did not translate into policies changing fishers' behavior because they started to look for the new material after the giant clams were forbidden. So the story of fossilized giant clams shows that state-led environmentalism might be used to sanitize territorialization of marine spaces by civilizational crackdown campaigns on destructive marine harvesting facilitated by subsidies that were precisely used to produce such territories. So the fishers were used, then they were blamed. So, and I don't know whether we have time still.
Yes, a little bit.
Yeah, so I will just quickly go to the Vietnamese case. So as I said, Vietnamese fishers also receive subsidies. They are much more modest than Chinese, but they have to also squeeze several trips during the year and go at least 150 nautical miles. And they have to operate in the areas where there is basically no fish. And they have to think how they could strategize, because you have to imagine that going to the sea, it required to buy a fuel, provisions, water, food, electricity, everything that cost, and it costs a lot. Even so, even if they get the subsidies, they still want to make some kind of profit. And what they do, so when the Chinese fishers extracted all giant clams, fossilized giant clams on the Chinese side, they struck the deal with Vietnamese fishers whether they could find on their part of the disputed water. So, and then how the cooperation start also between this seems the rival groups. So what we see, like we have British Channel, the Channel Islands in the UK, when the French and the Channel Islands fishers comes in conflict towards, with the Brexit. Here, the South China Sea dispute basically brings the fishers together. So on other occasions, the Vietnamese fishers might embark on a month-long trips, source enough water, food, and fuel, and trespass into Australian exclusive economic zones and the Pacific Islands, engaging with the extractions of alive giant clams in protected areas. So there were cases in 2014 when the Australian Fisheries Management arrested the fishermen on the sea, and basically they extracted, I think, over 100 huge giant clams, and they were so rare that biologists took them for research because they were new species. And the Australia actually make a graveyard in the National Wildlife Park in Northern Territory, which commemorate the death of this giant clams. On other occasions, they basically sneak into Malaysia or other Southeast Asian countries where they buy freshly caught seafood. So they have different strategies. They also retrofit their boats to accommodate large freezers, so they don't go even for fishing. They buy seafood on the sea, and that's extend the periods of their presence in the sea. So just to wrap up at the end, so basically, subsidies, harmful subsidies, they are connected with lack of transparency and accountability around regularizing vessel standard and government's expenditure on the fisheries sector. And they sustain massive operation and unproductive fishing fleets in the disputed waters in the South China Sea, regardless whether resources are already depleted or not, and not coordinated with other natural resources management policies. So they might incentivize the short-term income and profit for fishers, but in the long term, they basically make more damage and harm than bringing benefit. And I want to end with the quotation from the actually Vietnamese scholars, and I think she's based in Tromsø. And then she wrote in her article that about the subsidies. So first, they enhance the profitability of fishing, at least in the short run. Second, by motivating fishermen to build large vessels, then can go fishing offshore. Subsidies help demonstrate sovereignty and presence in disputed areas. This may be important for future negotiations with neighboring countries on national exclusive zone, which basically shows how important the presence of fishers, regardless whether they fish or not, is in the South China Sea. Just to maybe the last point is that fishers are not passive actors, like instrument of the South China Sea, countries. They are not basically also pushed by the external forces like lax regulations. We might think about those, but they are actors in their own rights and making deals in their own rights. They could be the drivers of territorial dispute, to the extent that their mobilities and their livelihoods they will defend on behalf of the state or in contravention of the state. Mm-hmm. And so that's the end. And if you are interested, I have a few publications which basically wrote about that. So in the Anthropological Quarterly, which takes more anthropological perspective, and the recent forthcoming in the Singapore Journal of Tropical Geography, which maybe from more different angle, and also my think Hang, Xiefe and Lucas, they work, and they have also they are forthcoming papers in marine policy and in other journals, so you can look at check regularly to find out what they write and how they also interpret and contribute to the wider outlook of this South China Sea dispute and basically knocked-on effect in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful and insightful presentation. Can I leave? Do I still have to?
Yeah. I could keep.
Okay.
Now. I can just now keep.
Okay. And you seem to be very productive, and you seem to have a very productive team from what you just showed us. I have so many questions, and we have about 15 minutes. I will take about 15 minutes before I open the floor for Q&A. What I would be interested in, that you describe fishermen as actors, as very active actors, not passive actors. And do they have, like in this maritime dispute where a lot of dispute settlement, a lot of interaction is going on between states and between states actors, do they have institutionalized channels where they can voice their interests and concerns?
Well, they are first. They I think it's on the local level. The government, because they have to be updated with the maritime law. So they receive the training. They have to report their trips to Coastal Guard. So it's in that sense, it's highly institutionalized. There is also, in terms of weather announcement, whether they can go to the sea out or not. And I think that's, and of course the fisheries organizations, they create themselves fishing organizations. These are channels where they could talk about the problems, but I don't know whether they, but it's not in the terms of that they could make some particular claims, political claims. It's rather in the terms of the daily survive and daily difficulties at the sea, for example, that they need more protections in terms from the coastal guard, or if they feel like one side feel bullied by the other, so they could say that we don't feel safe, but they are organized. Of course, they are those fishing organizations also on the Chinese side, where they basically a fishing association where they could discuss. But claims are done in different ways. So actually, the fact that they extract giant clams or other species, or they make the deal. It is the way how they basically projected their voices. This is the way because what is happening, if we're thinking about the exclusive economic zones, so it's the state nationalized those spaces. Once they are nationalized, it's very easy. The next step when comes privatization of those areas. And basically fishers are excluded and kicked out. And they don't have the same relations with those areas as they have in the past. So this kind of activities, through the embodied actions and practices, this is how they voice their presence in the sea, and basically keeping with their livelihoods, keeping up with their maritime livelihoods.
So it's basically it's a form of contestation also.
Yes.
And are there like NGOs that are also involved in maybe representing their interests, or like? Because you say they get easily blamed. On the one hand, they got this subsidies, but then they engaged in overfishing, and then the states, especially the Chinese state, I'm not sure whether this also applies to Vietnam, blames them for overfishing. The state actually incentivized them to do so. So are there NGOs in the region that kind of mediate between these interests, or that try to, or have their own interests?
I didn't follow any NGOs. I was not interested in NGOs, to be honest, in Vietnam. But I could say that, for example, Australian fisheries management authorities, when basically Australia faced the huge influx of Vietnamese fishers coming to their maritime zones, they were like 3 years arrest. They contacted Vietnam. They asked Vietnam for the actions, and they actually organized a workshop in the province, Quang Ngai province, from which the biggest number of fishermen basically was involved in those very much extensions of the fishing practices to Australia. So, and they were quite proud. Australia was quite proud of providing this kind of workshop and capacity building, and trying to bring awareness of fishers that they basically that if they trespass maritime zones, if they engage in the illegal fishing, they basically will also face dear consequences of that. So, and also in the terms of collaboration, I think Japan, Vietnam, Thailand, so there are some regional cooperation which basically try to provide Vietnam with the models how basically such a sustainable fishing could be implemented. And that's particularly is important in the case because Vietnam got the yellow card in 2017 and put a deadline for 22 to basically improve their fishing practices. Evidence shows that there is indeed some improvement. I think from the 5th place in the world of the worst, fishing practices, they fall down to 56. The worst country, which is, I think, quite a progress. They're still quite high on the scale, but there is some progress. But there is evidence which shows that basically has to be more done that and Vietnam face also the dangers that of the red card, and I think that's what they want to avoid. So I think Japan and Thailand are others. So there is some kind of. So I didn't look at the NGO. I have to say I just was not interested in that. I didn't, because I'm much more interested actors on the ground. But I know that there is a regional collaboration in that, and might be that some of these NGOs are from those countries, but I'm not sure about that.
Okay, thank you. Then we go back to the ground, to the fishers. You started your presentation with a very interesting way, namely a very historical approach, how conceptions of nation states and territorial sovereignty actually affected and affected the region in terms of that they put labels on communities that didn't traditionally did not correspond to that. So one question would be, how much do these traditional conceptions of unboundedness and also their maybe ethnic not nation state identities, but ethnic identities affect fishermen's relationships with like among each other?
I think what I would say, it's kind of hidden cosmopolitanism, which basically goes back to many generations back when I have a fascinating actually example from the historical sources which I read from Vietnam, which shows that basically Vietnamese Navy who basically one of the islands started as a Royal Navy units, which were gradually turned into the civil settlement. And what it shows, this historical documents, that basically fishers were, the people were recruited based on their skills, and they were Cham, who had the suburb fishing, seafaring skills. Through the surname, we could see that they were refugees from China, from the Minhuang or Minxiang refugee. They were the Viet people who, and so the Navy was basically based on Cham seafaring skills, on Chinese trading capabilities, and on Viet sovereign claims, and their basically occupational skills override their ethnic affiliation, and they would become basically the Viet subjects in Vietnam. So so that's what we have the case, and we have a lot of historical sources which talks about pirates, for example, in the South China Sea, and there is the questions whether these pirates were Cantonese, whether they were Viet, or they were Japanese or Chinese. So sometimes it's very difficult to because people switch also their ethnic affiliation. And yeah, if we have, for example, if we are from the mixed marriage, I just imagine Japanese or Norwegians, depend where you are and how you feel, you just identify with those ethnic. So these things are not fixed. And just coming to your question, so I think what comes now when they basically, there are cases they were telling me that they meet sometimes on the sea. They have even Chinese fishers were telling me that they have lunches on the board of fishers. They eat together, for example, when they meet, and they make some small deals or trade cigarettes exchange or some alcohol, vodka during their fishing operations. So there is this kind of cosmopolitanism which goes through generations with those fishers.
Okay, so a lot of identities that are hard to capture in fixed terms. Yeah. I have another question regarding international laws and institutions. So you talked about the subsidies extensively. Yesterday, Alan Chung and Alfred Gerstl were agreed on something that, for me, not being from the field, was quite surprising. They said that international organizations and laws, especially when it comes to dispute settlement, did more harm than good, especially the UNCLOS. What do you think? Do you agree with that, with this interpretation or their conclusion?
I'm not a legal lawyer, a scholar, but I have been at the workshop, I think 3 weeks ago in Oslo on Arctic, and then they were specialists on the South China Sea, also legal scholars, and they were also quite how to say, conscious about the ruling of the Permanent Court in 2016. So they have also sometimes mixed feelings about the outcome of that, because it's the consequences. But I think the problem with UNCLOS is that it doesn't provide a very rigid way how you delineate your maritime spaces. So there is quite a bit of room how you could do that, and that basically creates the whole problem. And probably UNCLOS cannot really provide the ready receipt, because geography is such a diverse, and we have so many precedents around the world. And if we look at for example, at the Channel Islands and UK, and now the whole Brexit, so there are also certain level where they basically UNCLOS creates all these issues, how to delineate, how to basically claim that. So I would agree to, in the sense that basically it inside those countries to think rather than inclusively on more exclusive base, because everything becomes resource at the end and property. And then when you think in those terms, about the property, about the resources, and how, and then basically how you could protect that for the national interest. Yes. So yes.
So the reason why I asked this question, since you focus on fishermen, it's very and my question was more like, do these international laws and dispute settlements actually reflect interests of fishers, or do they just reflect interests of states?
Probably yes and no. That you are not happy with this answer. So they are different stakes in those disputes. But I think I would say, look, we should look at, for example, Tonkin Gulf, where the China and Vietnam got agreement on the fisheries quotas, on the fisheries management. So I think it's possible to collaborate and take the interests of fishers and provide some kind of sustainable model for the fishing zone and collaboration. Basically, leaving the sovereign claims out. And of course, it would be great if that kind of collaboration could be, about the protection, management of fishing stock and fisheries, if that would be done also in those paracels and spratly areas when the sovereign claims are left out. But they are not left out, so it means that the state claims and might be much more important.
Yeah. Thank you. Very interesting. Very, very last question, and then I give the floor to the audience. We have already questions in the online. Yeah. Fishermen, it already implies that most of them are men. I don't know. So you said you were on ships and you talked to these fishing communities. How difficult was it for you, as a foreign researcher, but also maybe as a woman, to get access to these actors?
First of all, I never do hidden research, so has to go through all approval. You apply for visas, whether in China and Vietnam. You have affiliation with the university, and basically the local government also received the documents that basically I'm coming and doing research. So that is based on the long-term relation. I have worked 20 years in Vietnam, in China a little bit less. That helps. Fishers, I use the fishers gender neutral term. I don't like the term fisherman because it excludes women, and women are part of fishing communities and they play an enormous role. I haven't been on vessels going to the like long trips, so I was on a board when they are stationed and they show me, but it's because it comes the sovereignty claim. So I'm a foreigner. So if you go, if you enter and you go on the ship, so it means that you are also in this very sensitive areas and put. So for that you need another special agreement. And there are also practical issues, 15 men, 1 woman, no toilets, no shower, how you are going. So they also ask, so what we are going to do with you, in those spaces. So they are all this practical also limitation for being, but it doesn't mean so, but I was allowed to get, they invited me, they show, we talk, and anthropological research is about building relations. So we don't do research like a helicopter research that you run, hit the subject and go back. We build relations with people and we stay a long time, 2-3 months, or even for my PhD, I stay for 1 year. And it means that we know people, we know their wives, we know their sisters, we know their uncles. People tell about themselves, and we're trying to tell them about our life too. So it's built on the relation.
Very, very beautiful. Challenging, but sounds very beautiful. A lot of encounters. Okay, so now we go to the Q&A session. Is there any question in the audience here? Otherwise, I would start with the online questions because they're already there. Maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you talked about the artificial islands in the South China Sea. Is this like only a way to expand the territory, or do the fishers use it in a practical sense?
Practical sense?
Like, do they use the islands in any way?
Well, if you think about coral reef is the breeding ground for small and big fish. So the fisherman told me, actually one Chinese old fisherman told me, if there is no small fish, there is no big fish. So if these areas are turned into the like concrete bases, they are military bases, they are like for the meteorological bases. So it means that also the whole ecosystem is changed. So and fishers basically they talk about the depletion of the fishing stock, and they compete because there is too many of them and too little fish in those areas. So to answer your questions, I don't think so that building those islands improved the fishing stock and provided fishers with bigger amount of fish to catch. Just to put this boldly.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll take one of the online questions. I hope I can read it. When the EU, I read it out to the others as well, to the offline audience here. When the EU involves in fixing the IUU fishing, one of the first attempts to reimpose the strict EEZ through vessel monitoring system. That was one of the first attempts. Yeah. To make sure that Vietnamese fishers do not go out fishing outside the EEZ. What does the traceability of the new fishery governance mechanism mean for disputes with China and other countries?
Thank you, Alin. Hi, he's in Uppsala and we just corresponded recently. so I didn't have opportunity, to follow that closely because of COVID, and I'm going only in October to Vietnam. But what I know that indeed there is a new law. I think if I will just make some notes on that. In 2017, which basically required from fishers have this monitoring system. I think the boats at least measured 15 meters or more has to be equipped with a satellite positioning equipment. But there is actually we know that despite the Vietnam Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development claims in success of tackling the EU fishing in domestic and both international waters, there are emerging reports that basically fishers also could switch this off, and that's happened also on the Chinese side. So I think there is effort to provide these monitoring systems. I have to say I haven't yet looked how widely that is. When I was before COVID in Vietnam, many of them they have GPS system, and but basically those who extended to Australia, they always claimed that they didn't have any GPS system. There was no monitoring. So now the question is whether each vessel has indeed this monitoring, and what they do, whether they could basically switch this or not as they wish. And they are basically reports that this is what it happens. So I think that this traceability of new fishers, it might be still on quite cosmetic level, but it is put, but how actually practically operate, that's another way for those crews to learn. And basically also that Vietnam, in the case of Vietnam, there is a challenge also because once again we have different levels of government, and some local governments try to maybe are more strict to basically checking that. The other are more lenient, more relaxed with that. So it depends on the local province and local authorities too.
Can I give that back to you? Okay. Do we still have time for one question? Yeah. Okay. Is there a question here in the offline audience? No? Then we take the one in the online audience again. Many thanks for the overview covering the historical and current perspectives of the maritime militia in the South China Sea. There were discussions in the media about China's People's Armed Forces maritime militia, sinking Vietnamese maritime fishing militia in the wake of COVID-19. Are there similar encounters with other fishermen of other nations with claims to the South China Sea? Are these groups active in areas not in the South China Sea, like in the seas of the
Southeast Asia?
Southeast Asia, yeah. Thank you.
I think they are, of course, this also violent confrontation between the Filipinos and Chinese fishers. So when the Filipino occupies also the military occupies certain rocks. So Vietnamese probably and Chinese are not the only one. I know that there are also these confrontations between Malaysian and Vietnamese. So that's go on very different, angles, because the Vietnamese encroach into Malaysian exclusive zones, and then sometimes they are attacked by so-called pirates, which Vietnamese claim that they are basically coastal guards, hidden coastal guards. So they were telling me about those issues. I had interesting conversation with actually Filipino scholar who listened my presentation, I think in June when I was giving in Singapore online, and because the Philippines were considering whether they should also establish maritime militia like Vietnam and China. And they are very careful with that, but they try to find out. And one of the things they said, well, we have a bit different historical legacy with the South China Sea. So, but there are some consideration which not might turn into the real actions. But I'm not sure about the Southeast Asia, like for example, Thailand, if I'm thinking, or Cambodia. I have never heard about that. I think in Thailand we have the rather problem with the basically Peter van der Ver's geographers, he told me not slavery but the enforced labor. So in the case of Thailand, so I think there is a bit different issue there. I don't know whether that answered the question, but
you should ask the audience. So, but you definitely answered the question for me. Okay, thank you very much. We're already over time. Thank you for this, for your wonderful insights and for sharing your insights and your research with us. Thank you to the audience in the offline and in the online, and for actively raising questions. And tomorrow we're gonna have the third and last breakfast meeting on the South China Sea, with this time with a legal perspective. So everybody again is invited to join us tomorrow. Have a nice day.
thank you very much, Julia.